During the latter years of the Viking era, the Norse were known to set off on a voyage with a prayer to keep them safe from fire, storms, and Curonians. The three things that could sink a ship full of Norse warriors and send them to their deaths. The famous Viking Ragnar Lothbrok fought with them, as did many others. Meet the Curonians, the forgotten tribe that were so fierce that even Vikings had trouble with them. Inhabiting the rough coasts of the Baltic Sea, whipped by storms and restless waves, these men were much like their surrounding environment. From even their earliest mentions, the Curonian tribe was known as the fiercest, most hostile, and pagan of all the Baltic tribes. Centered around a strong warrior culture, they were highly territorial and had a penchant for raiding and seafaring. So much so that they mastered the art of shipbuilding and sailing in a manner much alike to the Vikings, and they became known as Baltic Vikings. From very early on, the Curonians were involved in alliances, wars, and raids with the Scandinavians to their north and northwest, namely with the Icelandic, Danish, and Swedish Vikings. Ironically, while Vikings were renowned for raiding Western Europe, it was their own shores that often fell victim to plunder by the Curonians, the Devil tribe from the east. One of the earliest raids of the Curonians into Viking lands on record is dated to around 750 AD. The Saga of Nornegist mentions that the lands of Sweden were attacked by the Kurir, a Viking name for Curonians. Soon afterwards, they are mentioned again in the context of the legendary Battle of Bravalla, a crucial conflict between the King of Sweden, Sigurd Hring, with his allies, the Goths of Västergotland, against the King of Denmark, Harald Wartooth, and his allies, the Goths of Östergötland. This battle saw the use of mercenaries and allies from all over the north of Europe, from Slavs, Irish, Frisians, and Norwegians, and of course the Curonians. The next significant mention of the Curonians is around the year 840. We learn that it is in this year that the legendary Viking leader, Ragnar Lodbrok, leads a raid into the lands of the Curonians. There is very little information about the outcome of this little excursion. Nonetheless, Vikings return again in 853, only to be utterly defeated by the united Curonians. In the following year, 854, the Curonians are said to be openly refusing to submit to Sweden and pay her tribute. The Danes then tried to get the upper hand and force these fierce Balts to pay tribute to them instead. A large Danish army entered the lands of the Curonians, going after their chief and most important hill fort, Apul. But this all ended very badly. Danes were utterly beaten and all their loot and riches were stolen. When the Danes failed miserably, Swedish King Olaf decided to take matters into his own hands, invading Curonia once again, this time with a large Swedish force. He sacked and burned an important Curonian city of Grobina and proceeded to besiege Apule. A force of around 15,000 Curonian warriors could not be subdued, and they held out day after day for 8 days until finally they decided to surrender. This was the first major defeat of the Curonians. However, Swedes did not dare to stay in Courland, and as soon as they left, the Curonians were back plundering their shores. The conflicts and tensions with the Vikings of Denmark and Sweden continued to grow over time. Most of their attacks on Curonian lands were in retribution. The Norsemen sought vengeance for the repeated raids of the Curonians and the Oselians on their shores. The Oselians, another tribe residing north of the Curonian lands, were arguably equally formidable. Together, these allies often launched raids, marking their presence in history with notable attacks, such as the plunder of Åland Island in Sweden in 1170, which ignited the fury of their adversaries. This event was a part of a long-standing tradition of aggression, with Adam of Bremen labeling the Curonians as the most cruel tribe as early as 1075. The partnership's audacity culminated in 1187, when they razed the Swedish capital of Sigtuna, an act attributed to heathens from the east, likely a joint Oselian-Curonian endeavor. These incidents, highlighted as the most notable, reflect a broader pattern of pagan raids, a common occurrence, as described in the contemporary Livonian Chronicle of Henry, underscoring the enduring threat they posed to their neighbors. And even when in peace and alliance, Curonian longships attacked the trading ships of the Danes, earning a reputation for their brutality. The absolutely ruthless way of warfare conducted by the Curonians, combined with their prowess in battle and ferocity, made them a feared force. As the centuries passed, almost all of Europe was fully Christianized. The Curonians, on the other hand, were not. They still fiercely clung to their pagan belief and were amongst the last pagans of Europe. That is why, in 1202, a special military and religious order was created, known as the Brothers of the Sword, with the sole intent of conquering and Christianizing the Baltic lands. These consecutive campaigns, with the aim of relieving the Balts of their pagan faith and freedom, became known as the Livonian Crusade. The wars against the Curonians lasted from approximately 1242 to 1267. The Crusaders, under the auspices of the Pope, moved against the Curonians as well as their relatives and close allies, the Semi-Gallians. But once more, the Crusaders were surprised by the ever-restless Curonians. In 1210, the latter assembled and attacked the city of Riga, the main stronghold of the Crusaders. Sadly, the Curonians could not conquer the fort and were repelled. They tried again in 1228, this time allied with the Semi-Gallians. Riga once more stood unconquered, but the pagan Balts managed to inflict some losses, destroying the Daugavgriva monastery and massacring all the Christian monks they found there. After several decades of strained conflicts, numerical disadvantage, and several defeats against the Crusaders, the fierce Curonians were at last brought to their knees. By 1266 AD, all Curonian resistance and rebellions were quelled, and all of their territories were partitioned between the Archbishop of Riga and the Crusaders of the Livonian Order. From that moment on, an intense process of erasing their Curonian identity began. These people gradually lost everything that made them distinctive. Their pagan religion was the first to disappear, while their unique Curonian language was eradicated step by step and became completely extinct by the 16th century. And so, the legacy of the Curonians faded into history, leaving behind only their name, Courland, as a silent testament to their once formidable presence.